I'm Abigail.
I still remember that Thanksgiving dinner like it was yesterday. The table was set with a warm glow, and there were 15 of us gathered. At the head of the table stood Mrs. Harrison, her face a mix of nerves and determination. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. Last year at a table like this one, I said something I'm ashamed of to someone who deserved better than what I gave her, she began. My heart skipped a beat as I watched her look down the table at my mother, Clara. Mom sat there, calm and composed, her back straight. I couldn't help but let my mind drift back to the events that led to this moment. It all started a while ago, when I was in a relationship with Ethan Harrison. Ethan was an architect, a quiet and thoughtful man. We'd been together for a few years, and things were going well until we reached the point of marriage. Ethan's mother, Mrs. Harrison, was a well-to-do woman. She came from a family with a long-standing reputation in the community. Her husband, Mr. Harrison, was a successful businessman who'd passed away a few years back, leaving her with a large inheritance and a certain social status to uphold. My mother, Clara, was a remarkable woman. She'd been a community nurse for 25 years. When I was 10, my father passed away in a car accident. Mom was left to raise me on her own. She worked long hours, waking up at 5:30 every morning to start her rounds. She'd check on the elderly, administer medications, change dressings, and offer a listening ear to those in need. I remember when I was 8, Mom would take me with her on some of her shifts because she couldn't afford a babysitter. I'd sit in the corner of the patients' rooms, doing my homework while she took care of them. There was an old man named Mr. Thompson. He had Alzheimer's, and Mom would sit with him for hours, holding his hand and talking to him. She'd sing him old songs, and he'd smile a toothless smile. Mom was the highest-rated nurse at the local community health center. She had certifications in geriatric care, wound management, and first aid. She was always proud of her work, and she'd often tell me, "Abigail, not everyone can do this job. It takes a special kind of person." When Ethan and I got engaged, I was so happy, but I soon realized that Mrs. Harrison had different ideas. At our engagement dinner, she was polite at first. She asked about my job as a primary school teacher, but there was always an underlying tone. She'd point to Ethan's architectural degree on the wall and say, "I wonder if teaching really requires such a high level of education these days." As time went on, her true colors started to show. At the rehearsal dinner, which was held at a fancy restaurant in town, she finally made her move. There were 12 of us at the table. Mrs. Harrison's side included her 2 sisters, a couple of her bridge club friends, and a neighbor. On my side were Mom, her best friend Lily, my bridesmaid Sarah, and Pastor Tom, who would officiate our wedding. Mrs. Harrison arranged the seating, putting herself at the head. Ethan and I were in the middle, and Mom was placed at the far end, between Lily and an empty chair. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. The first part of the dinner went well. There were toasts and laughter. Pastor Tom told a heart-warming story about a couple he'd married many years ago. But then, after dessert, Mrs. Harrison started making her rounds. She saved Mom for last. She pulled up a chair next to Mom, sat down, crossed her legs, and with a smile that sent a chill down my spine, she said, "Clara, I don't think I've ever asked, what exactly do you do for a living?" Mom put down her fork, folded her hands on her lap, and in a calm voice, she said, "I'm a community nurse. I've been doing it for 25 years. Mrs. Harrison didn't even look at Mom. She turned to the whole table and raised her eyebrows. "Oh, so you take care of sick people for money," she said, as if it was something to be ashamed of. The room went silent. Lily put down her knife. Pastor Tom looked at his plate. Mrs. Harrison's sister, Mrs. Jenkins, covered her mouth with a napkin, but I could hear a stifled laugh. Mom just smiled. It was a smile of strength and dignity. "Someone has to," she said simply. Mrs. Harrison laughed and patted Mom's shoulder, the way you'd pat a dog. "Well, at least you're honest about it," she said, then stood up and walked back to her seat. Mom reached under the table and squeezed my hand. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not tonight." I sat there, with a mouthful of words I didn't say, and I felt so angry at myself for not standing up for her. The rest of the dinner was torture. Mom finished her water, laughed at Pastor Tom's stories, and complimented the dessert, but I could tell she was hurting. She didn't eat another bite. After the dinner on the way home, Mom said, "Tomorrow is your wedding, Abigail. That's what matters." I knew she was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. A few weeks after the wedding, Mrs. Harrison invited us to a family dinner. She made it seem like it was just a small gathering, but when we got there, it was clear she was trying to show off. The house was filled with fresh flowers, and she'd cooked a fancy meal. She introduced me to a neighbor as Ethan's wife, the schoolteacher. Her tone was condescending. "I'm sure teaching is a nice little job," she said. After the meal, when I asked about having Mom over for a family dinner, she just said, "Oh, these are just for close family, dear. I'm sure your mother understands." Over the next few weeks, Mom's name never came up at the Harrisons' table. Mrs. Harrison planned a big summer party, and Mom wasn't invited. When I asked Ethan about it, he said he'd talked to his mother, but nothing changed. One day, I ran into Mrs. Jenkins at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable and pulled me aside. "Abigail, I need to tell you something. My sister has been saying that Ethan married down. She thinks your mother's job is nothing special." I was furious. I went home and told Ethan everything. He promised to talk to his mother, but when he did, she denied it all. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said. A little while later, I noticed something at Mrs. Harrison's house. There was a prescription bottle on the kitchen counter. When she stepped out of the room, I managed to read it. It was for high blood pressure, a high-dose medication. Ethan later told me that her doctor was worried. She'd been ignoring her health, and she was at high risk of a stroke. I called Mom to tell her. Mom, without hesitation, said, "If anything happens, make sure she gets to the hospital within the first hour. That's the critical window." I was a bit taken aback. "Mom, you don't even like her," I said. Mom sighed. "Abigail, I'm a nurse. It doesn't matter if I like her or not. This is about saving a life." Not long after, the call came. It was Memorial Day weekend and Mrs. Harrison was hosting a barbecue. Ethan had insisted that Mom be invited, and she'd agreed with a fake smile. At the barbecue, Mrs. Harrison introduced everyone with their important titles. When she got to Mom, she said, "And this is Clara, Abigail's mother. She takes care of sick people." One of Mrs. Harrison's friends, Mrs. Parker, asked Mom what that involved. Mom started to explain all the things she did, from wound care to emotional support. But Mrs. Harrison interrupted her. "Oh, she basically just cleans up after people," she said with a laugh. Mom's friend Lily stood up. "Clara is a highly trained nurse. She's saved many lives," she said. Mrs. Harrison just smiled and changed the subject. "Who wants more salad?" she said. Later, in the kitchen, just the three of us, Mrs. Harrison, me, and Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Harrison let her true feelings out. "I told Ethan before the wedding that he could do better. A teacher and a nurse's daughter," she said, shaking her head. "The Harrisons have standards." I was so angry. I set down the plate I was holding and said, "Anyone? Can you, Mrs. Harrison? Can you stay up all night with a dying patient? Can you comfort a family in their time of grief?" She lifted her chin. "Don't you dare raise your voice in my house," she said. "I'm not raising my voice. I'm asking you a question," I said, my hands shaking. She didn't answer. She just walked out of the kitchen. On the way home, Ethan and I had a long talk. I told him that he needed to stand up for my mother. Finally, he said, "You're right. What she said was wrong, and I'll talk to her." But before he could, the worst happened. One Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Ethan. "Mom had a stroke." "It's bad," he said. I rushed to the hospital. When I got there, Ethan was in the waiting area, looking pale. He told me what had happened. Her neighbor had found her on the kitchen floor, unable to move or speak. The doctor came out and told us it was an ischemic stroke in the right hemisphere. She'd lost motor function on her left side, and her speech was severely impaired. She'd need long-term in-home care. The doctor gave us a list of approved home care agencies. The first name on the list was the community health center, where Mom worked. Ethan called to arrange the care. When the scheduler told him that the only nurse with the right certification in the area was Clara, he was shocked. "Is there someone else?" he asked. The scheduler, Mrs. Brown, said, "Mr. Harrison, Clara is the best nurse we have. She's the only one with the right training within 30 miles. If you want to wait for someone from another office, it could be 2 to 3 weeks." Ethan knew we couldn't wait. So Mom was assigned to take care of Mrs. Harrison. That Sunday night, I went to Mom's house. She was packing her medical bag, just like a soldier getting ready for battle. I stood in the doorway and said, "Mom, she called you names in front of everyone. You don't owe her anything." Mom zipped up the bag and looked at me. "The woman who had a stroke is not the same woman who said those things. This is my job, Abigail. I can't turn my back on someone who needs help." The next morning, Mom went to Mrs. Harrison's house. When Mrs. Harrison saw Mom, her eyes went wide.
No.
"Not her," she tried to say. Mom just smiled and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison. I'm Clara, your nurse. I'll be here Monday through Friday, 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock." The first week was tough. Mrs. Harrison was difficult. She refused to eat the food Mom made, and she kept pressing the call button for silly things. But Mom never got angry. She just did her job with patience and kindness. As the weeks went by, things started to change. Mrs.
Harrison's attitude softened.
Mom found a pressure sore on her heel early, which probably saved her from a more serious infection. One day, Mom was doing range of motion exercises with Mrs. Harrison's hand. Mrs. Harrison looked down at their hands and said, in a halting voice, "Thank you." Mom just smiled and said, "Same time tomorrow?" Then one morning while Mom was doing swallowing therapy, Mrs. Harrison had a mini stroke. Mom reacted quickly. She called 911 right away and did everything she could to keep Mrs. Harrison stable. The paramedics arrived, and they were impressed by Mom's quick action. They said she'd probably saved Mrs. Harrison from a more severe stroke. Ethan was in tears when he called me. "Your mom just saved my mom's life," he said. After that, Ethan had a long talk with his mother. He told her everything Mom had done for her and how wrong she'd been to treat Mom the way she had. And then there was that Thanksgiving dinner. Mrs. Harrison stood up and made that apology. Mom just smiled and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. Now pass the potatoes." The room filled with laughter, and I knew that things had finally changed. Mom had shown that true dignity comes from doing the right thing, even when it's hard. And I was so proud of her. A few months after that, I found out I was pregnant. I went to tell Mom. She looked at me and said, "I can tell. Sit down, dear." We sat at the kitchen table, and she held my hands. Tears rolled down her face, and she said, "This baby is going to know what hard work and dignity look like because of you." Mom still wakes up early every morning, goes to work, and takes care of her patients. She's still the amazing nurse she's always been, and I know that no matter what, she'll always do the right thing.